Continuing where we left off, here's another one. Counter argument 2. Let's talk about this one that I've seen around pretty often. From Leviticus. Leviticus 19:33. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. We have the same issues as the last verses, but we have a new aspect of land. Let's highlight this to be exact. So we're seeing comeling, newcomer, stranger, and then finally foreigner for the New International Version. And also, this is the only version of the three that says them instead of him. Again, him can symbolize a group, but not necessarily. And I will bet that it does change your impression of what the size of this group could be. However, one thing I can say consistently here is that they all use the term your land for the land that a stranger comes to, and therefore making it clear that it still remains your land as they come, and you only share it again temporarily. And that understanding makes this verse make more sense, because of how it is understood to be your land. There's no indication that a stranger should have a portion of that land that your community has control over. And question for a modern context, when you lose majority, does it stop being your land? Because I would argue, yes, it does. It would be, at some point, just everyone's land, and at another point it becomes the majority's land. But this would then be the new majority that has come into your country. That said though, my radar was already going off here. I saw that this verse can be misused to push mass immigration. So, I decided to find the most misleading translations I could possibly find, and let's put them on the screen. From New Century Version, do not mistreat foreigners living in your country. From New Living Translation, do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. From Good News Translation, do not mistreat foreigners who are living in your land. From the Common English Bible, when immigrants live in your land with you, you must not cheat them. And finally, from the King James Version, and if a stranger sojourn with thee in your land, ye shall not vex him. So for now, ignoring the actual translation, what do you think from these versions? Are we talking about immigrants? Are they living in your land with you or just passing through? Are they immigrants, foreigners, or just strangers? Is there one or how many? Highlighting, I think it's pretty clear that it's not clear. And if I'm looking at some of these versions, the intention actually seems to be to change that original meaning and make it into something more politically beneficial. But Leviticus 19:34, foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So again, it's the same problems in translation of how many we're referring to and what their actual status is in the land, or country if you try to remove the possession of the land by the people. But here's an instruction to us, or to the Jews at this point within the Bible, to treat a stranger the same as a person born in that land. That said, when we say as a native for someone born in the land, the translation from Brown Driver Briggs tells us, of man, native Israelites. And for that dwells, the direct translation overwhelmingly points towards temporary dwelling, being to sojourn, dwell for a time, to abide, stay, temporarily dwell, to be a stranger, to be continuing. So again, we're given this as a direction for the Israelites. And we should not think that foreigner or immigrant means a permanent resident. Those words have had their meaning changed at this point, just quite simply. Even then, we can dig deeper, covering similar Old Testament verses and finding how strict this was. Because if you caught the implication that born among you would be born among the Israelites within this translation, then suddenly we would traditionally be considering the conversion of people born outside of the tribes of Israel, which would indicate total cultural and religious assimilation historically. From Study Light, per the law of Moses, this was strict, and it does appear in the New Testament, so what are we saying for modern times? This means that if you treat someone as one born among you, it makes perfect sense to treat them not just with leniency, but put them under the same laws, the same penalties, and expect them to assimilate into your culture. And as John Gill explains from this last verse that we were reading, the stranger dwelling in the land of Israelites was only given civil and religious rights if they were a proselyte of righteousness. So, to gain such rights, they had to fully convert and they had to obey all applicable rules. It's civil rights only given through cultural conformity. And in relation to the population demographics that we're talking about, the population percentages that we have, I do have some very relevant data. So, looking at verses from 2 Samuel 24:9, we have, in Israel there were 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000. So if we need the Israeli men, then if we multiply that for the women, children, and elders of just Israel, we get about 3,080,000. That's an approximation, but a pretty common one. And then we read from 2 Samuel 24:15, so the Lord sent a pestilence on Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and there died of the people from Dan to Beersheba 70,000 men. Okay, so we need to subtract that. So we're given men could mean all the people who died, so we just subtract from the original number, 70,000, and then we get 3,010,000. Or we could take men as fighting men, which we will then multiply for the pestilence by the same population multiplier that we used, which gives us 2,810,500. Or we could count the men as all males who died of the pestilence regardless of age, so then we're just going to use a multiplier of 2, just for male and female. We're not going to assume the relationship between childbirths and deaths of war for this. So we're going to take 2,940,000 as the resulting number from that subtraction. So then from another verse, 2 Chronicles 2:17, and this was the census taken by Solomon, so we're a couple decades apart from these two censuses, but this is actually going to most likely give us an absolute maximum since we're not even accounting for the likely population growth after Daniel's census and after the pestilence. So we got 153,600 total strangers in Israel during Solomon's reign. So we just take that by and divide by the numbers that we just calculated on the last slide, and we get 5.1%, or 5.4%, or 5.2%. And I want to stress again, these are the maximum percentages of strangers within the land of Israel at that point, not counting Judah. And we would assume that we're not counting Judah within this verse. So what we end up is fairly low numbers, of fairly low percentages, and this could be strangers from all over. We're guessing that they're from a variety of countries, so they're not even a uniform block of people forming this, a little bit more, a little bit less than 5% of the population. And it's also worth mentioning in context that even though Solomon's census was taken for bringing foreigners together to build the temple, well, they were still not considered as citizens of Israel, so we can keep that in context, that they were still considered outside of it. They were involved in building the temple, but one idea behind why foreigners were preferred in building was, in writings, it seems like the Israelites were not as good at building as other cultures were at that point. So more, this is migrant labor, and they're not really being considered a part of the country, even though they are in the census and they're registered as being there. To get an idea of some of this in practice, actually, we don't need to look any further than Israel, both past and present. From June 24, 2020, Israeli High Court allows DNA testing to prove Judaism, which is an indication in this case that Judaism is not just a religion, but it is, to some extent, a genetic cluster. That's kind of messy to say, there is certainly a lineage there. And specifically, it's allowing national membership to, in part, be through your genetic lineage, your genetic cluster, your race. And even though Israel does host multiple races within their borders, we could certainly say that Israel is very concerned with keeping their own cultural identity as strong as possible. Now, by comparison, this is a chart showing the minority share of the US population by age group. And just look at how insanely fast this has happened. This is not really the result of birth rates, this is immigration, already making current generations of America non-white, while supermajority white generations are still living. And this was 2015. So realistically speaking, right now, I want to ask you, whose land is this? When we read those counter-argument verses, one of the most consistent things we read across different translations was the phrase, your land. So what percent of strangers or foreigners do you think will make it ultimately not your land, even to offer help to strangers? Now, counter-argument 3. We're in the New Testament, and so far I've been able to cover many common arguments that center around particular words with misleading translations or they're out of context. This will be the same, because for this section we'll look at the word neighbors. Matthew 5:43. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So this is a very often cited verse, and a nice one. It identifies that you do have enemies, you do have people that persecute or slander you, but still you are to at least pray for them. This is a change from the command to love your neighbor, and that's even more important, I think. The word neighbor is used numerous times, and I've seen it used to push tolerance, but we really need to answer what a neighbor is exactly. From the Greek plesion, meaning near, nearby, or neighboring. That would be less specific, but that's actually only one definition. And it's certainly not the full context of how these commandments were originally taken to mean to love your neighbor. From Thayer's Greek lexicon, we have a great deal more context for this word in translation. First, for definition A, for Matthew 5:43, it's intended to mean friend. And question, isn't a friend more merit-based, not just who lives nearby? But for translation B, relating to many other verses on neighbors. So here it's just outright stated that the Old Testament and Judaism understand neighbor to be specifically a member of the Hebrew race and commonwealth. And didn't I tell you? Given that, didn't I tell you the whole Old Testament is very ethnonationalist? Ultimately, it's just reality, really, that Judeo-Christian values are not shared, and therefore there isn't really a Judeo-Christianity. Certainly not in any practical sense or practice. However, Thayer is maintaining that the meaning of neighbor is altered by the parable of Jesus, so we'll have to read Luke 10 for this. But don't be confused by that writing within Thayer. The other verses mentioned here, for Matthew, Mark, Romans, James, all of them, are just the command to love your neighbor, often repeated, and we have covered that pretty extensively. So actually, per Thayer's description for this, the alternate meanings for neighbor come from those verses in Luke. And that means to some extent we finally found it. We found the last major argument that I and Thayer seem to know of to give the Bible a civic nationalist or even open borders understanding, rather than the traditional understanding which led to essentially ethno-nationalist nations for centuries. And since this new meaning is coming from the story, the parable itself, rather than any particulars of the language, I'm just going to read it straight through for you. Luke 10:25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on olive oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." This is a very interesting parable. In short, a man is attacked by thieves and ignored by 2 men from his same community, but then he is taken care of by a Samaritan, which is to say at least a man coming from outside of his immediate community. This Samaritan pays for the man and leaves. Now, if we go with a more modern understanding of what a neighbor is legally, these men should then live around each other, or should have lived around each other before, but the opposite is clear, made very clear. We're told specifically at the end of the parable that the Samaritan departs. We're also told that someone who proves to be a neighbor is in this case outside of the community, implying that even though the first 2 men would have been closer in location and ethnicity, they were not acting as neighbors. So yes, this does somewhat change our understanding of the word neighbor within later portions of the Bible. A neighbor is not just ethnic similarity alone here, however, we get 2 important conditions. The first one, a neighbor does not have to be related to your location, or even need to spend a long period of time with you. Just as we read previously about strangers to your land and saw that change to immigrants in recent versions. Well, this parable has the Samaritan coming from elsewhere and continuing on. Second, a neighbor is by merit. And for me, this really doesn't do much for a civic nationalist modification of the Bible compared to what we've previously read. I really need to stress that this parable is really not for immigration. If a neighbor can pass through your land and still be a neighbor, then it's certainly not an argument for foreign immigration. And our approach to that subject would be better found in other verses which we cover. Let's look at Thayer's translation for neighbor again. Well, read Luke. If we have the choice between friend and any other person for B, the answer is A, it's friend. From Luke, a neighbor is based on merit. So if we're told for the majority of the Bible to love our neighbor, well, from Luke we're asked to love our friends. But not just the friend that smiles and speaks nicely. Ultimately, our neighbors are the people who will be there when we need them most. So now question for you to ask yourself. Who in your life could you trust to support you, to protect you when you need it? Would that be your family? Or maybe it's your church congregation? And importantly, do a lot of these people share your ethnicity? Well, certainly your family will. And would a lot of these people have a common history with you and with your family? It's at this point that I also have to bring forward the racial reality of this parable. The Samaritans are a group throughout the Bible coming from and interacting with the most prominent Jewish group that we read about. I say coming from because they trace their ancestry back to 2 tribes of Joseph and have also used DNA testing to confirm their genetic cluster as closely related to other Jewish groups, especially the Ashkenazi Jews, which we often assume are the main Jewish group. It's not cited in their document, but I do believe I have a couple tests, a clear one from Shin et al. This was DNA testing from modern Samaritans compared to other Jewish populations, which suggested a common ancestor, and they write that this ancestor identified as the paternally inherited Israelite high priesthood. In this case, all biblical, historical, and genetic records point to Samaritans being particularly close to Ashkenazi Jews, being part of the 12 tribes of Israel and only being separated by the Assyrian conquest of Israel. The Ashkenazi Jews here are important because they are by far the largest group of Jews spread throughout the world. After this separation, though, the Samaritans and the main group of Jews had disagreements on religious doctrine and other developed cultural differences, while both of them do still practice Judaism, though the Samaritans call it something slightly different. One of the main differences is debate on which is the holy mountain to pray to. All of this is to say that in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the Jewish man and the Samaritan are still the same race. They would look very similar, and they were both practicing almost the exact same religion. Biblical and historical records show that Samaritans and Jews had a lot of developed animosity despite their closely shared ancestry and traditions, and that would be the reason for choosing a Samaritan specifically as the subject of this particular parable. Also, the proximity of their land at the time made interactions occur on their road, and the situation described in this parable was certainly possible. When I was first writing this, I thought about this parable in comparison to the British and Irish, but even then, those groups are far more differently religious, culturally and genetically. So, more accurately, the conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans was more like the hatred between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So, if we want to be specific and put this parable into genetic and historical context, the selection of a Samaritan in it is to address long-running grievances between people of the same race and very similar culture who lived immediately close to each other but did not share the same land. So that said, even if this parable had anything at all to do with immigration, it would not support a multiracial society or a society of worshiping different gods through its meaning and context. I don't want to focus on this context exclusively though. I do understand how this parable is often applied to the rest of the world, outside of the situation which Jesus chose to address most directly. If we didn't practice Christianity, for example, outside of its original historical context, then the lesson that Jesus taught wouldn't have left the Middle East. So apply this parable as you wish for situations around the world. It is a good concept of helping those regardless of community grievances, and especially because those community grievances were in that time and in that place, but it's definitely not about people of vastly different cultures sharing the same land and moving in next to each other. And then just contrast it with historical reality. Historically, for all races, the people that support each other towards shared interests have formed their groups based on shared ancestry, or an extension of the family, its lineage. And what's wrong with counting on and loving those who are closest to you and support you when you need it most? Certainly within the parable of the Good Samaritan, you have two people of a shared ancestry not acting as neighbors, and someone very closely related but hated acting as a neighbor. So individually, we certainly shouldn't just reject someone's kindness based on their community and shouldn't put all of our hopes in shared ancestry. A simple rule: don't consider people that want to harm you and your family as neighbors, no matter what their race might be. If they would like to harm you, they would be enemies even within the Bible. Pray for them, but defend yourself and your family. They are not your neighbors. This has maintained communities that actually build up the nations. Contrast this picture with modern sports teams. Is this a unified community coming together for a good game, or a mixed and match sports team based on winning numbers? Because my bet, looking at the sports team, is that when this particular team won, people knew it, they knew the people, and they actually cared a whole lot. And think to yourself, if you as a Christian have a racially homogenous congregation, can you count on many of these people as your Christian neighbors? I would certainly think so. And such a full church here, by the way, if you're looking at the picture. For me, I see nothing wrong with a church family being racially homogenous. There's certainly strength there. It's absolutely natural for Christian families to form this way, and I grew up in a church myself that was always vast majority white. And even as I wander from city to city and waver in my faith, I have a home to come back to. I have neighbors who I can always depend on. In contrast, I've gone to one church in one of the many cities I've lived in, which was racially and linguistically mixed. You might say Tower of Babel-esque. It was almost exactly 1/3 Asian, 1/3 Hispanic, and 1/3 white, and it had a main preacher and translators for each group. I was brought in initially when a really kind man reached out to me and invited me randomly on the street, but ultimately the church was very strange to me. The preacher gets up and talks a lot about the greatness of that particular church, and each sentence he has to stop for two people to translate, which breaks the flow. Then the sermon ends and we eat and have ice cream. Talking with people there, in particular, lots of young engineers, and it really felt like networking. So I'll encourage you to try the same, because this is just a comparison. The most racially mixed church I've been to, and I'll just say it felt less Christian in the end. As a side note though, there is some indication that integrating churches leads towards some more majority white views. So, congratulations, white supremacist Christians. Your supreme white version of Christianity wins. Again, I'm joking there. This article is hilarious, though, in that the researchers admit that they don't want people in mixed churches to think like white people. Mainly, they want everyone, including white people, to believe in racial discrimination by white people being the cause of large socioeconomic differences, as is a more common belief in Black and Hispanic churches. But when churches are integrated, everyone starts to think more about personal responsibility and less about discrimination. It's the horror to think that Black people don't think to themselves that they're victims when they go to church with white people. But I will say it reminds me of the European Revolution that I mentioned earlier. If you embrace more personal responsibility and those thoughts on punishment and the will to punish, the importance of the family unit, all of that transformed Europe, you will see large changes in communities. But ultimately, what can be said about this? The mentality of discrimination is in the first place only enabled due to forced proximity. And what I mean by that is that these groups just happen to be around each other, and that right now we're choosing a great amount of division with the hope for eventual unity, ultimately after we constantly vote against each other's interests, which allows the government to take advantage of this division. And it's dangerous and it's getting worse. But even today, your neighbors and friends can be largely unified. That is, unless you're living in a city, most likely. But if you have unity, it can help to build a stronger Christian community when people have neighbors that they can absolutely rely on. Or, alternative, is being a neighbor not at all to do with trust, love, and support towards common goals? Is it just a legal piece of paper that you own? The land lease? Just a happenstance of proximity? And who gets these papers is decided by a government that you probably don't trust anyways. Just consider an apartment. You have so many neighbors. They're so close to you, and they're so diverse, but you're not going to know most of them. Let's look at these maps of self-segregation in cities. When you see how people naturally organize themselves, even keeping in mind how many of these people would be Christian, can you really say that most people feel like their neighbors are just people legally nearby? Someone of absolutely any cultural background? Do they just need a couple more good Samaritans to pass through, help, and then continue before their neighborhoods start to want to be integrated? Which is to say, trust and value others more than their most extended family. People more likely to share their own culture and their goals. So I know we just went through a lot, but I do have one more common counterargument before I complete the cycle that I hinted at from the Tower of Babel. What can I say here? The Bible has been used and abused extensively to get you to act very differently from how devout Christians of the past acted and formed their nations. However, this argument is again useful to my argument and the greater context that I'm laying out within this. From Psalms 102:18, "Let this be written for a future generation, that a people not yet created may praise the Lord." So, first off, we're talking about the future, and I found this wording interesting. A people or the people not yet created. Between these translations, the people does sound more like it refers to future generations, while a people can sound like a nation, a tribe, or a race that will still be created in the future. And that's pretty weird. Continuing, Psalms 102:19. "The Lord looked down from his sanctuary on high. From heaven he viewed the earth, to hear the groans of the prisoners and release those condemned to death. So the name of the Lord will be declared in Zion, and his praise in Jerusalem. And the peoples and the kingdoms assembled to worship the Lord." For this, we have 3 different translations, and I find it interesting that only the Wycliffe version here says, gathering together peoples into one. So here the word choice one would indicate singular unity beyond just general assembly. However, two main considerations here. First is context. We're back in the Old Testament here, and whether attributed to King David or others, we are within the context of Jewish life. So we can say the peoples and kingdoms assembled are the people of Israel, especially when the verse before referred to Jerusalem. At the time, they had these boundaries set up to contain them. Most important overall, though, is that we don't have an indicated time for when this is to happen, in contrast to the borders set throughout the Old Testament. Would it be the reestablishment of Israel that we're looking at for this unity? For the larger context in another verse, I'll go through two verses where total unity occurs, with one on earth and one in heaven. For this subject, human-mandated unity versus natural unity, or heavenly unity, are entirely two different things. Historically, when government comes in and tries to legislate unity, it's been about having power over more people. Take, for example, colonial expansion in that case. They don't care if it causes more suffering and weakens unity. These are both benefits to a government that benefits when they don't have to represent the unified interests of a homogeneous people. Think of it kind of like a union breaking. And if we want to talk about the forced integration of America as an unconventional situation, just consider, do people who truly feel oppressed want to have more contact, more, or do they want to have their own freedom, their own nation, their own self-sufficiency away from all that? So many of these verses from the Old Testament we go through refer to this exodus from Egypt. And if that exodus was within the Old Testament a good thing, well, desegregation was again the exact opposite of that. It wasn't people fleeing oppression as in Egypt, and it wasn't Pharaoh coming to stop black people from leaving and embracing either Liberia or the black nationalist movements. It was people wanting more access to spaces built and maintained by white communities. In the words of MLK,
and this is a reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Now, Native Americans did the opposite. Not all of them, but many stayed on their own reservations and wanted to build their own spaces, have their own self-sufficiency to one extent or another. For desegregation, though, instead of communities naturally sorting themselves per their common interests and per spaces that both groups had built, the iron fist of government stepped in and said, no, you will live together, because we have that exact arrogance that we can make this happen no matter what nature says otherwise. And this is certainly not freedom. Let's take one more look at some of these naturally occurring boundaries. I want to ask you, what was the point of the government forcing people together? They're not a unified people. They divide themselves. But then again, just like in union breaking, it does give the government a significant political advantage. So now we're out of the counter arguments again. And while we're looking at this desegregation era, let's look at a significant verse that was used by segregationists. Hope to see you back for part 3.